Hi folks, this video is about Nietzsche's most famous quote, "God is dead." In order to understand what he means by that, we actually have to ask a different question first. What is Nietzsche's view of science? What I want you to do is pause your videos here and think about what you've read of Nietzsche from his quotes, um, and what you know of his views of religion in order to really understand what he would think about science. So pause your videos and try to think about this for a minute. Okay, that was your chance to try to figure it out. There's two layers to this. There's two levels of depth, and I'm hoping everybody at least saw the first one. That is, Nietzsche, as the arch atheist and critic of religion, is probably a fan of science. So he says things like, "Long live physics!" You know, belief in the Christian God is unbelievable. So he sounds like he's the atheist champion of science in the duality of science versus religion, which is sometimes posited. For example, Nietzsche's coming out of this modern Enlightenment period in which the new science and the scientific revolution was initially opposed by the church and the Aristotelian view of physics that was attached to the church, and the creationists who thought that the earth had to be at the center of the universe. And so the new physics, Copernicus and Galileo, that posited that the earth revolves around the sun, was heretical. So in this environment, and in many ways, even today, we still see science and religion pitted against each other. Nietzsche seems like he would be the champion of science and the critic of religion. But what's really essential to understand is that is only half of the story. His view of science is much more complicated than that. Remember that we talked about Nietzsche. Nietzsche asks us he demands that we ask two separate questions: whether something is true, and then what does it say about life and the health, the system of values promulgated by it. So all ideas, all systems of value can be seen as systems of power. Values are power, and they're often motivated by hidden motives. So he says this about religion, he says this about philosophers, and he's at least consistent. He says the same thing about science. So this is the second level of his view of science. He's concerned with science not just about whether it's true or false. He wants to know, what's your approach to science say about you and your approach to life? Because science is often put as this objective search for truth and truth at all costs. And if you do that, you can just be just as much an ascetic as a religion is. And if that's your science, then Nietzsche is not going to be a fan of it. Science can be a form of sickness too. So he says, it's in bad taste to have a will for truth and truth at any price. And he's not going to buy it. He says we're too serious, too merry, too profound to have that view. So here's the more complicated view of Nietzsche's conception of the relation between science and religion. So firstly, he starts with the idea that Christianity has this fundamental, powerful set of values, and pre-scientific revolution, Christianity has this idea that truth and honesty are these are fundamentally pious, holy, godly values. And we see this really deeply developed throughout the history of Christianity. It was hugely dominant in the medieval period when Christianity ruled all of Europe. What happens then is this concern with honesty and truth is actually a big boon for science. And the scientific revolution grows directly out of the systems of religious education set up in the late medieval period. So the theological schools really are where the scientific revolution started. This was absolutely essential to the progress of science. So science, it seems like it's irremediably a good thing, and from the perspective of Christianity, because it is just the pursuit about truth about the natural world, God's creation. But then the great irony, according to Nietzsche, is what we have is secularism hits like an atomic explosion in Europe. Science makes this scientific discovery that you can't believe in Christianity anymore. Christianity is not true. But science retains something from Christianity, though. It keeps this concern, with truth at all costs. And it's even at the cost of its own origins. So science takes up truth at all costs and then ends up rejecting religion, ironically, as a result of it. So at one level, Nietzsche does think science gets things right. It has this, it wins in some sense over Christianity. It is not false, it's not refuted, it's not unbelievable in the way Christianity is unbelievable for him. But there's a deeper story here, because science can have the same deep problems. It could be an illness just as much as religion is, according to Nietzsche. And what people often miss, if they just focus on the first question about the truth and falsity of science versus religion, they miss the fact that regardless of whether Christianity is true, as humans, we have a spiritual side. We are not just insects and worms. We at one point Nietzsche says we're this amazing blend of insect and ghost, or plant and ghost. I mean, that's a line that almost could have been straight out of Dostoevsky. We have the deep spiritual need. And when Nietzsche talks about the death of God, this is how I'm going to get back to his famous quote. That quote can mean two fundamentally different things. And people normally focus on just the first meaning. What it means is that Christianity is false. But that is not fundamentally Nietzsche's concern. And so that if that's all that death of God meant, we would miss everything that Nietzsche really cares about, because that's the way people usually focus on the significance of the quote. And I think that just totally misses the boat. Remember, let me go back to Nietzsche's critique of Plato and religion when he's asking those two separate questions. And I said, it's not fundamentally Nietzsche's concern with whether or not Plato is right or wrong. He wants to take the second question of what is Plato's views about reality tell us about Plato's own state of health. Does his philosophy spring from health or sickness? So when we see this in the death of God passages, in two ways. And I think you might have noticed that there's this subtle aspect to the death of God passages that is emphasized over and over by Nietzsche. And it's another metaphor, and that's why it's hard to understand. What I'm talking about here is the talk about the shadow and the death and God's shadow. So look, here's where death of God is first stated by Nietzsche. It's not in the famous passage 125. It's actually in 108, the earlier passage, which I have you read. Nietzsche says, it's not just Christianity as well. Buddha is dead, and his shadow still has shown for centuries. And God is dead, but what are we going to do about the fact that his shadow is around? We have to vanquish the shadow as well, according to Nietzsche. Notice the shadow comes up 4 times in his first quote about the death of God. We see the same thing in another famous passage. So this is later on, 343, which you'll read the entirety of soon. He's explaining what he means by the death of God. And here we actually see the two things. So it means that the belief in the Christian God is unbelievable anymore. So this is the factual question, like Christianity as a metaphysics or as a view of reality. It is factually false. There is no God. That's level number 1, the thing in red. But the level number 2, the shadow, this is the second thing, I think, that is so essential. The shadow is our spiritual need. The fact that the shadow of God still stands for, we need something to fill that void for us. Because science doesn't just fill that void in its search for truth, because we are interested in science and scientific truths from our own motivations. And you can pursue that out of a point of health or as a point of sickness. Okay, so this distinction between the factual question of God's existence and our spiritual need, those are the two layers to the quote about the death of God that I really want to emphasize. Let's look at his famous quote. 125 is where Nietzsche has this famous little parable of a madman who runs through the village shouting that God is dead. Well, first he's shouting, I seek God. Notice a couple things about this. Nietzsche's view that God is dead, which is so often just taken as a factual rejection of religion, is so much more complicated and deeper than that. And I think that is actually, the factual matter is less than 10% really of the depth of his interest in the quote. Notice he puts the quote in the voice of a madman. So this is something that I think people sometimes forget. So his famous passage about the death of God is not in Nietzsche's own voice, but it's put in a parable, which again shows how hard it is to read and understand Nietzsche, the layers of metaphor. I mean, he heaps metaphor upon metaphor. They get sometimes like 6 layers deep, and it's really hard to untangle what he's getting at. Notice a second thing that people often miss about this passage. When the madman shouts that God is dead in this passage, he is not shouting it to the theists, to the Christians, at least not directly. He first comes saying he's seeking God. He's talking to those who don't believe in God. So it's not just about Nietzsche shouting in the face of the clergy that atheism is true and their God is not real. That's not fundamentally what he's concerned with. And I think when we reflect on the literary aspects of this parable, that becomes more apparent. Let me say how some of the other metaphors bring this out too. So here's some of the other passages. We've killed God, so we did it. It's deicide, which is fascinating to think about that questions of responsibility that Nietzsche is talking about here. What does that mean for us? And he says, look how he just piles on the metaphors. Because we have killed God. I mean, that's a metaphoric or a symbolic claim. He connects that with drinking up the sea. He connects that with using a sponge to wipe away the horizon. And he connects that, fourthly, to unchaining the earth from his son. We are now 4 layers deep in metaphors, and he hasn't explained any of them. He just heaps one upon another. Now, look, we get a 5th metaphor here. Talk about lanterns and the need for lanterns to banish the darkness. A 6th metaphor, when we're talking about the decomposition of God. Notice how Nietzsche is returning to the earth here. He is, in a sense, completely rejecting the idea that God could be this disembodied other spirit, and instead treating gods as creatures of the earth, as if they literally decompose. He is returning them to the body, and he returns everything back to the earth. Now, think about what lanterns and light mean here. So this connection, these metaphors are deeply connected. Light and lanterns connect to the sun as the source of truth. This goes to Christianity and to Plato. That think about the root word of the word enlightenment. Light coming onto us is the metaphor for coming to great knowledge and deep insight. And it functions at another level too. So the horizon, what does the horizon mean here? A sponge that wipes away the horizon. This is like the field of meaning that gives our lives significance, because the light and the sun aren't just necessarily factual sources of value, but they're sources of spiritual meaning to us. There are the things that nourish us. That's what the sun does. But think about another layer to this metaphor of unchaining the earth to the sun. This goes back to the question of the Enlightenment and the meaning of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution versus Christianity. This goes back to Copernicus and why Copernicus and Galileo were viewed as so threatening to the Christian church. Because on the medieval worldview, it is God created Earth and humans as the pinnacle of his creation. We were the center of the universe on this medieval way of thinking, and for some fundamentalist Christians today even. And so the idea that actually, no, the whole universe is just governed by impersonal forces, and it's the force, and the Earth is just revolving around the sun, and the sun is revolving around the Milky Way galaxy, and that is just spinning in this immensely enormous void. We are just a speck of dust. And I mean, this is a quote of Nietzsche's that we'll see later on. Humans are just a speck of dust on the tiniest speck of dust in the middle of nothingness. It is like this picture that we get from the modern scientific worldview, in contrast to this deeply significant world in which humans are the center of everything, the center of value on Earth. This is what it means to unchain the earth from the sun. And of course, later on when Darwin posits that we're just a product of the same evolutionary forces that, led to the rest of the animal kingdom, we have, those are viewed as in the exact same direction that Nietzsche is talking about here. So we don't have this privileged position in creation anymore in many senses of the word. And that means that it looks like we don't have ultimate sources of value anymore. But the trouble is, we still have a need for sources of value. That's why Nietzsche asks whether or not we can admit the ultimate significance of it. And this is what returns us to the concept of the shadow of God, the thing that lingers. Are we capable of really understanding what it means for God to be dead? Not just because it's a factual question, but because it's also a spiritual question for us. So Nietzsche goes on, he says things like, how are we going to comfort ourselves? That this is getting onto the spiritual needs that we have, because we still have need for comfort. If we are the murderers, this sort of interesting, ironic, metaphorical way in which he takes it, that we literally killed God, don't we then need atonement? But what would it mean to need atonement? Atonement is a religious concept. So in many ways, Nietzsche is saying we haven't got over our needs, the same needs that lead us to embrace religion. He says we need to still invent sacred games. We still have a need for the sacred. And if we don't admit that, then we are not going to be great enough. We're not going to understand the tremendousness of the event. So must not we ourselves become gods? This talks about the creation of values and the need for this, the need for values and the spiritual side in which values give us something, not just deeply impersonal, objective, scientific, truth at all costs. And so I think when Nietzsche talks here about the event still being on its way, of course, he's just adding more metaphors. It hasn't yet reached our ears. It's still more distant than distant stars. I think what he's talking about here is the fact that people haven't realized, even in his time, the second level of the question that we have this deep spiritual need. And then ironically, the way in which Nietzsche is often still treated today, people still don't look at what he thinks is important about the announcement of the death of God. That is not just the factual question about atheism. It's about our spiritual need and how we're going to fill that void. And this is precisely how Nietzsche is such an important existentialist thinker, because he doesn't think that once we get over our religious impulses, we have no longer any need for meaning. In fact, he thinks the question of the need for meaning becomes all the more acute once we admit that religion doesn't fill that void for us anymore. So I just want to say one last thing. His quote, "The God is dead," I'm saying, has two fundamental meanings. The first level is just the factual one. And then the second one is the deeper spiritual one. And I think that second one, you have to understand the second one if you really want to get what he's saying. And this ties back to what I've talked about in some of the other lectures, which is this idea of Christianity as an illness and his fundamental metaphor of sickness versus health. Because remember, with that metaphor, his fundamental concern was not with whether Christianity is true or false. And I think the death of God does the exact same thing. His fundamental concern is not with meaning number one. It's with meaning number two, and the fact that we have this spiritual need. Or to just connect this with the talk of sickness and health, the reason he indicts religions is further asceticism, and he would do the exact same thing for philosophical views. He would do the exact same thing for approaches to science. If any of it is tied up with asceticism, he's going to heap scorn on it. He thinks that's fundamentally problematic. And the fact that we still need health, that Nietzsche still has his own systems of value that he thinks we all need to embrace systems of value. That is that second meaning to the death of God, I think, is the more important thing. And that's connected with this concept, his health metaphor. Okay, thanks.